Hey guys, tonight we're climbing down into the belly of a pirate ship, on the one night in her short, loud career you'd have paid actual money not to be aboard her. The night 300 tons of stolen slave ship timber, something like 4.5 tons of stolen gold and silver, and roughly 146 men trying to catch a few hours of sleep between watches all found. Themselves in the same square mile of freezing April ocean, with a 100-year storm bearing down on them from the northeast. We're talking about the Wider Galley, flagship of Samuel Black Sam Bellamy, one of the wealthiest pirates who ever lived, wrecked on a sandbar about 500 feet off what is now a quiet public beach in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. Welcome to the night of April 26, 1717, a night so violent that out of everyone who tried to sleep, wake, pray, or simply hold on inside that hull, only 2 men lived long enough to describe what it sounded like from the inside. Go ahead and dim the lights. If you've got a fan nearby, switch it on and let it hum, not like a fan tonight, more like wind starting to work its way through rigging that has no business holding together much longer. You're warm right now. Wherever you're lying, you're dry. Nobody below you is creaking. That will stop being true for 146 men in a few chapters. So take a second to enjoy it while it's still yours. Let's ease into tonight's journey together, starting, appropriately enough, not with the storm, and not even with Bellamy, but with the ship herself, and the ugly trade she was built for long, before she was anybody's pirate flagship. The chase had already lasted 3 days by the time anyone on the Wider Galley's quarterdeck stopped believing they could outrun it. It was late February of 1717, somewhere in the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, and Captain Lawrence Prince had done everything a merchant captain of the period was trained to do, crowded on sail. Cut across shoal water where a heavier vessel might hesitate to follow, prayed for a wind shift that never came. A merchant vessel of the period carried nowhere near the crew or the armament of a purpose-built raider, so distance was really Prince's only strategy from the first sighting on. Run for shallow water, hope for a squall. Hope for a nightfall thorough enough to slip away under cover of darkness. None of it worked. Behind him, 2 vessels under the command of Samuel Bellamy and his partner Palsgrave Williams kept closing the gap a little at a time, the way a debt collector closes a gap, patiently, because they already knew how this ends. When the Wider finally struck her colours, her hold was still packed with the last of a fortune in gold dust, ivory, sugar and indigo, the paperwork of an honest voyage nearly completed. Bellamy's men swarmed aboard to find something better than treasure. They found the fastest ship most of them had ever stood on. That's what makes what happened to her captain worth returning to, because it's a detail worth sitting with before the ship herself takes over the story. After Bellamy gave Prince the Sultana and let him sail off with the bulk of his original crew, Prince did what any surviving captain of the era would do. He made for the nearest port and reported the loss, and his account of the encounter is one of the sources historians still lean on for reconstructing exactly how the Wider changed hands. He went on, by the fragments of record that survive, to continue working as a merchant captain in the years that followed, an oddly quiet, almost anticlimactic ending for a man whose ship became one of the most famous pirate vessels in American history, and a small, pointed reminder that not every story from this era ends in a gallows or a grave. Some men simply walked away, filed their report, and went back to work. Given everything else that happens in tonight's story, it might be the single luckiest ending anyone gets. Here's the thing about the Wider Galley that made pirates want her so badly they'd chase her for 3 straight days. She wasn't built to be caught by anybody. Laid down in London in 1715 for a Member of Parliament named Sir Humphrey Morris, launched in 1716, she was a 3-masted, square-rigged galley, just over 100 feet long and about 300 tons, modest by warship standards. But built for speed, capable of better than 13 knots in good wind, which in 1717 was roughly the nautical equivalent of a getaway car. The galley in her name wasn't decoration. She carried oar-ports along her sides, sweeps that could be run out to move her through dead calm or manoeuvre her in a harbour when the wind refused to cooperate. A feature almost no honest cargo ship needed, and almost every pirate captain dreamed about. Her owners hadn't built her fast because they expected to be chased by pirates. They'd built her fast because speed meant a shorter Atlantic crossing, which meant fewer of her original passengers died before the ship reached port. And that's where the story stops being a simple one about a fast ship and a lucky pirate. Because the wider galley's actual maiden business, the reason she existed at all, was the transatlantic slave trade. She was named for Ouida, sometimes spelled Wider, a port on what's now the coast of Benin, then the seat of the Kingdom of Ouida, one of the busiest slave-trading harbours in West Africa. On her outbound leg she had loaded African captives along that coast and carried them across the Middle Passage to Jamaica, where, according to the surviving trade records, roughly 312 people were sold into slavery before she ever crossed paths with a single pirate. This is not incidental background colour. It's the ship's whole reason for being fast in the first place. Faster crossings meant a lower mortality rate among the enslaved people locked below, which meant a healthier, more profitable cargo at the other end. Efficiency, in the coldest possible use of the word. She had unloaded her human cargo, taken on a return cargo of gold, ivory, sugar, and indigo bound for London, and was 3 weeks into that return leg when Bellamy caught her. What happened next has a strange, almost fairy tale shape to it, and it's worth sitting with for a second before the rest of tonight's story gets grim, because this is one of the few genuinely warm turns in it. Bellamy didn't kill Lawrence Prince. He didn't maroon him, didn't torture him for the location of hidden valuables, the way pirate legend so often insists happened. According to the record, he gave Prince his own former ship in exchange, a smaller sloop called the Sultana, and let him sail away with most of his original crew intact. It's the kind of gesture that earned Bellamy his nickname on Cape Cod long after his death. The Prince of Pirates. A man who, so the story goes, preferred not to do anyone a mischief he didn't have to. We'll spend an entire chapter tonight on whether that reputation was earned or invented after the fact. For now, just sit with the picture, a captured slave ship captain walking away alive with a ship of his own, while the men who'd taken his cargo turned their new prizes bow north. Turning the Wider from a slaver into a raider took work, and it's worth understanding what that conversion actually looked like below decks, because it tells you something about who was doing the converting. A slave ship's lower deck was built around one grim purpose, maximising how many chained human beings could be packed into the smallest possible space, with low headroom and minimal ventilation, designed for control rather than comfort. Bellamy's crew tore much of that architecture out. Where shackle points and dividing platforms had been, they built out gun decks, cutting new ports and mounting cannon until the Wider carried 28 guns. Some later accounts, likely exaggerating for effect, claim as many as 60. Where cargo space had been calculated in bodies per square foot, it was recalculated in barrels of gunpowder and sacks of coin. The ship that had been engineered to survive the ocean while carrying human suffering as efficiently as possible was now engineered to survive a fight. Picture a factory floor gutted and rebuilt overnight into a warship, except the workers doing the rebuilding were. By more than one historical account, partly made up of men who had escaped slavery themselves, sailors of African descent who'd been freed from captured vessels along the way, and chose to join Bellamy's crew not as prisoners, but as full members under the ship's articles, drawing an equal share like anyone else aboard. That's the detail worth sitting with before we move on tonight. The very deck timbers that had once been fitted out to imprison African captives were, within a matter of months, being walked by African sailors who'd signed their names or made their mark as free men, entitled to vote on the ship's course, entitled to a share of whatever she took next. It doesn't erase what the Wider was built for. Nothing could. But it's a strange, specific kind of irony that history occasionally hands you without asking permission, and this is one of the cleaner examples of it from the whole Golden Age of Piracy. To understand what 312 people sold into slavery actually meant, it helps to widen the lens for one segment, because the Wider's single voyage was a drop in a much larger, much longer trade. Historians estimate that European vessels forcibly transported somewhere in the range of 12 million African men, women and children across the Atlantic over the trade's several centuries, and that something close to 2 million of them died during the crossing itself from disease, malnutrition, or the sheer physical brutality of the conditions below decks. Shipping registries from the period occasionally specify exactly how densely a vessel of the wider's tonnage was rated to carry human cargo, translated by slave trading agents into a grim arithmetic of bodies per ton, captives shelved along platforms built directly into the hold at intervals just tall enough for a person to lie flat, with almost no room to sit upright and no meaningful sanitation beyond what could be sluiced out during the brief periods anyone was allowed on deck. It's worth sitting with that arithmetic for a moment against everything else in this chapter, the same 300 tons that would soon carry roughly 180 pirates in relative freedom, voting on their own course, drawing an equal share of whatever they took, had months earlier carried several hundred people in chains, with no freedom, no vote, and no share of anything at all. Same hull, same 300 tons. Two entirely different ideas about what a human life aboard her was worth, separated by nothing more than which side of the transaction a person happened to be born on. None of what follows tonight is meant to soften that fact or trade it in for a better story. It's the flaw everything else in this chapter is built on. The man who financed that arithmetic is worth a segment on his own, because his story doesn't end with the wider at all. It ends somewhere far stranger. Sir Humphrey Maurice, the ship's owner, wasn't simply a private investor dabbling in the slave trade. He was, by the surviving shipping records, the single busiest independent slave trader operating out of London in the early 18th century, financing something on the order of 100 voyages over his career, and personally responsible for transporting an estimated 25 to 30,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. He was wealthy and connected enough to sit as a director of the Bank of England for years, and in 1727 he was elected the bank's governor outright, a position roughly equivalent to running a national central bank today. Here's the part that reads almost like a joke history wrote at its own expense. After Maurice died suddenly in November of 1731, rumour holding that he'd taken poison rather than face exposure, investigators discovered he'd spent his final years quietly embezzling close to £29,000, worth something like £7 million today, from the very institution he governed, along with the trust funds meant for his own daughters. London newspapers of the day were considerably more scandalised by the embezzlement than by the decades of human trafficking that had funded his rise in the first place, which tells you something uncomfortable about which crimes 18th century high society actually treated as crimes. Historians who study him have taken to calling him, with a certain dark irony, the Prince of Slavers. He never lived to learn that a ship he'd built for one kind of profit had been stolen out from under his captain, and turned, however briefly, toward a very different kind of prince altogether. Back aboard the ship herself, it's worth understanding just how thorough Bellamy's refit actually was, because it changed more than the wider's firepower. It changed what kind of life was possible aboard her. A slaver's lower deck was compartmentalised and low-ceilinged by design, built to a captive's dimensions rather than a sailor's, with barely enough headroom in places for a grown man to sit upright. Ripping that architecture out to mount 28 cannon meant knocking through bulkheads, widening gun ports, and reinforcing deck beams that had never been built to absorb recoil, all of it done at sea or on a hasty careening beach rather than in a proper shipyard. The 18th century nautical equivalent of gutting a cargo van and rebuilding it as an armoured truck, using nothing but hand tools and whatever scrap metal happened to be lying around, and somehow having it hold together well enough to outrun Royal Navy patrols for the next 14 months. The men doing that work, remember, included some of the very people the ship had originally been built to imprison. There's no gentle way to phrase what that must have felt like, swinging a hammer into the same timbers that had once held men in chains, and turning them, plank by plank, into something closer to freedom. No surviving account has anyone saying so out loud. We only have the plain fact of it, sitting quietly in the ship's own construction and crew records, 300 years on. The port the ship was named for deserves a moment of its own. Because Whydah wasn't a generic label, it was one of the single busiest points of departure in the entire transatlantic slave trade. The Kingdom of Whydah, on the coast of what's now Benin, sat along a stretch of West African coastline European traders, had taken to calling, without any apparent irony, the Slave Coast. And by some scholarly reconstructions, more than 1 million captives were forced through Whydah's beaches and holding pens over the trade's several centuries, a single stretch of shoreline responsible for a meaningful fraction of the entire Atlantic trade's human toll. Naming a British-built slaving vessel after the place so much of her cargo would ultimately originate from wasn't sentiment. It was closer to branding, the same unsettling commercial logic that leads a company today to name a product after the raw material it's built from, except the raw material here was human beings, and the naming happened without a flicker of apparent self-consciousness from the men who financed it. Every time a sailor said the ship's name aloud, in other words, he was naming the wound the entire voyage existed to inflict, whether he thought of it that way or not. This, then, is the story of the Whydah Galley, the only slave ship in the recorded history of the Atlantic world known to have been captured by the very kind of men she was built to imprison, and turned, for a little over a year, into an argument that the ocean didn't have to work the way it had always worked for her. It's a short argument. It ends off the coast of Massachusetts in a matter of minutes, on a night we'll get to. But before that ending, there's a great deal of living to do aboard her. Voyages, votes, gambling losses, a boy who begged to come aboard, and a system of governance stranger and fairer than almost anything available to an ordinary sailor of the period, pirate or otherwise. Let's go meet the men who lived on her. The Whydah didn't run herself, and the story of what daily life looked like aboard her is really the story of the roughly 140 to 180 men who kept her moving, fed, armed, and, improbably, for a ship full of outlaws, mostly orderly. To understand that life, it helps to stop thinking of yourself as a spectator and start imagining yourself as one of them. You didn't choose this. That's worth establishing first, because Hollywood pirates volunteer with a grin and a wink, and most real ones didn't. Say you were a carpenter aboard a merchant vessel the Whydah's fleet ran down somewhere off the American coast in the spring of 1717, not an unreasonable guess, since Bellamy's crew, like most pirate crews of the era, badly needed skilled tradesmen and routinely pressed them into service whether they liked it or not. The smell hits you before anything else does: tar, bilgewater, gunpowder residue, and under all of it the sour reek of several hundred unwashed men living in close quarters for months at a stretch. Then the sound, the groan of a hull working under sail, men's voices in half a dozen accents and at least 2 languages you don't recognise. Then you understand where you are. Congratulations, you're a pirate now, whether you signed up for it or not. Here's the good news, if you can call it that. Pirate crews needed carpenters alive and functional far more than they needed prisoners. So does the Whydah's real Thomas Davis, a Welsh ship's carpenter who was, by his own later testimony, forced aboard against his will when his vessel was taken. He wasn't given a choice so much as a job description. His skills were too valuable to waste on marooning him, and his life, as unpleasant as it now was worth more to the crew afloat than dead on principle. Davis kept his tools, kept his trade, and this matters for later, kept a careful mental account of everything that happened around him. The kind of account a man keeps when he's quietly hoping to explain himself to a judge someday. Your first days aboard are less about swashbuckling and more about learning a schedule. The ship runs on watches, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, around the clock, and within that grinding rhythm there's an entire hidden economy of gambling, storytelling, and small mercies. Rations run to salt pork, dried peas, and ship's biscuits so reliably infested with weevils that men learn to tap the biscuit on the table first and let the insects run out before eating, treating it as a minor housekeeping chore rather than a horror. Fresh water goes brackish within weeks in wooden casks, so it's cut with rum whenever rum is available. which, on a well-provisioned pirate ship fresh off several captured cargoes, is often. The pirate version of a company lunchroom, except the vending machine dispenses weevils and the water occasionally makes you drunk by accident. One thing strikes you almost immediately, before you've even learned anyone's name. This ship does not sound like the merchant vessel you were taken from. English is common enough, but you also hear Dutch, fragments of Portuguese, the particular cadence of West African languages carried by men who joined the crew as free sailors rather than captives, and the occasional word of mosquito passed between the ship's pilot and whichever crewman happens to be standing nearest him. A pirate crew of this size and reach draws its men from every ship it's ever taken, which means 140-odd sailors aboard the Wider in the spring of 1717 likely represented, between them a dozen or more distinct backgrounds and languages, closer to the crew of a modern container ship than to the uniform, single-nationality crews merchant vessels of the period typically carried. Nobody aboard seems to find this remarkable. It's simply how the work gets done, orders relayed through whoever happens to share a common tongue with whoever needs to hear them. A rough, functional multilingualism built entirely out of necessity rather than education. You came from a ship where everyone spoke the same language and answered to the same king. You are now, whether you like it or not, part of something considerably stranger, and, in its chaotic way, considerably more like the modern world than the one you left behind. By your first week aboard, you've learned the shape of the ship's actual power structure, and it isn't what the merchant service trained you to expect. The captain gives orders in battle, and in battle only day to day, the real authority belongs to a man called the quartermaster, elected separately from the captain, who settles disputes, doles out discipline, and divides plunder. You watch him break up an argument over a stolen shirt with the calm of a man who has done this 50 times before. No violence, just a ruling. Accepted, because everyone aboard voted this man into the job, and everyone aboard can, in theory, vote him back out. It is, without exaggeration, more democratic than the merchant vessel you were dragged off of. The bad news is that none of it makes you any less far from home. 3 weeks out, the fleet takes a Portuguese-flagged trader, and you watch the machinery of pirate law run in real time. Every man aboard gets called by list, in strict rotation, to board the prize and take his pick of clothing and small valuables, a shift of shirts, a decent pair of shoes, before the larger cargo gets divided by share. Thomas Davis goes up the list same as anyone, forced man or not, because the articles don't distinguish between the two once you're aboard and working. He comes back with a coat 2 sizes too big and a look on his face you can't quite read, something between shame at taking it and relief that, for one afternoon at least, nobody's shouting at him. Small mercy. The system doesn't ask whether you wanted to be here. It just makes sure that, now that you are, you get your share like everyone else. Not every off-duty hour goes to gambling, and it's worth mentioning the quieter version of the evenings too, because it's easy to let the danger of this life crowd out everything else about it. Men who've spent months together in close, dangerous quarters develop their own small rituals of comfort. A fiddle or a drum brought aboard from some captured ship, warm decks of cards traded hand to hand. Storytelling that runs long into a watch nobody's in a hurry to end. Thomas Davis, for all his caution, is not immune to it. You catch him more than once sitting near enough to a game or a song to be part of it, without quite joining in. A forced man's careful middle distance from a crew he still isn't sure he belongs to. There's a kind of hope built into these small, ordinary evenings that's easy to miss if you're only looking for the violence. Men who, whatever brought them here, choosing every night to make the ship something closer to bearable for each other. One song, or one hand of cards at a time. That fragile ordinariness never entirely erases the other fear running underneath it. Every sail on the horizon might be a Royal Navy patrol, rather than another prize. A 3-masted galley flying no colours, or false ones, invites exactly the kind of attention no pirate crew wants, and more than once during your months aboard. A lookout's cry sends half the ship scrambling to quarters before anyone's certain whether the approaching vessel is friend, stranger, or hunter. Most of these alarms end in relief, a merchantman as frightened of you as you briefly were of it, or a neutral trader with no interest in a fight it can't win. But the Navy's ships were out there in genuine, growing numbers by 1717, tasked specifically with hunting crews like this one, and everyone aboard knows exactly what capture by one of them means. Not a Boston courtroom with a chance at acquittal, but a much shorter path to a rope. You learn to read the change in the deck's mood the moment a strange sail appears, the particular quality of silence that falls over 140 men, all doing the same math about their own survival at once. Somewhere in your second month aboard, you meet the ship's surgeon properly for the first time, when a rigging accident leaves a topman with a badly broken arm, and what you witness clarifies something about this crew's priorities you hadn't fully grasped yet. A captured or recruited surgeon was among the most valuable men on any pirate ship of the period, valuable enough that crews would sometimes go out of their way during a raid specifically to capture a ship's doctor, rather than let him go free with the rest of the prisoners, because trained medical men were scarce and pirate life produced no shortage of work for them. The setting and splinting you watch happen on the open deck, with rum serving as the only anaesthetic available and 2 crewmen holding the injured man still while the surgeon works, is crude by any modern standard and remarkable for its era all the same. This is, after all, a man receiving real medical attention from a trained professional, care considerably better than most poor sailors of the period could expect to receive back on land. The injured topman, once patched and healing, doesn't lose his share for the weeks he can't work. The article's compensation scale exists precisely for men like him. It's one more small, specific piece of the same pattern. A crew of outlaws who built, almost by accident, a working system of care that the honest world around them mostly hadn't gotten around to yet. By the time the ship makes its second landfall to careen, hauling her over on a beach to scrape the barnacles and shipworm off her hull, a filthy back-breaking job that takes days and leaves half the crew coated in tar and rotten weed, you've stopped flinching at the casual violence of the work and started noticing its limits. Punishment aboard is swift but oddly procedural. Theft from a shipmate might cost a man his ears and nose, slit as a public mark of dishonesty, and then he's set ashore somewhere he's likely to survive, not simply killed. Quarrels between crewmen aren't settled with a knife in the dark. They're settled ashore, formally with pistols or cutlasses, under a quartermaster's supervision, following rules almost identical to a duel between gentlemen. It is, in its brutal way, a legal system. You did not expect a pirate ship to have due process. Here's what nobody tells you about outlaws. Some of them built better courts than the country you just left. Climbing the rigging is where you learn the real hierarchy of fear aboard a ship like this, and no article of agreement prepares you for it. The Wider's masts rise well over 100 feet above a deck that's pitching under you even in calm weather, and going aloft to reef a sail means climbing rope rat lines with bare or barely shod feet, in wind that gets sharper and colder the higher you climb, to wrestle canvas that weighs as much as a grown man when it's soaked through. 3 things keep you from falling: a firm grip, a healthy respect for how the ship is rolling beneath you, and the flat understanding that nobody is coming up after you if you slip. Sailors of the period had a grim little saying for it: 1 hand for the ship, 1 hand for yourself, because the moment you forget which hand is doing which job is usually the last mistake you make. You are, by your second week aboard, considerably better at this than you were on day 1. You are also considerably more aware of your own mortality than you've ever been in your life, and there's no article, no vote, no quartermaster's ruling that changes the arithmetic of 100-foot fall onto an oak deck. By the time the ship makes open water again after her first careening, you've learned that idle hours below decks run almost entirely on gambling, dice most commonly, cards when someone's managed to keep a deck dry and unmarked, and endless small wagers on everything from the next day's weather to which prize ship will fall to the fleet next. It's a loud, occasionally vicious economy, and the articles have rules for it same as everything else. A man caught with marked cards or loaded dice faces the same theft penalty as a man caught stealing from the common stock. Because to the crew's logic, cheating a shipmate out of his winnings is exactly the same crime as cheating him out of his share of plunder. You watch a dispute over a game of dice nearly escalate into a formal duel one evening. Two men red-faced and shouting over a handful of coin that, by the ship's own accounting, neither of them would likely keep for more than a week before losing it right back. The quartermaster settles it before it reaches the point of pistols, a stern word, a demand that the coin be split, a warning that the next offence goes to formal arbitration ashore. It's a strange kind of comfort, watching armed, dangerous men submit to a process rather than a knife. You didn't expect that from this life. Neither, probably, did most of them, before they lived it. The careening itself, when it comes, is worse than anything the daily routine has prepared you for, and it's worth walking through in some detail, because it's some of the hardest physical labour anyone aboard performs all voyage. The wider has to be run up onto a sheltered beach at high tide, then hauled over onto her side using block and tackle rigged to her own masts, exposing one entire flank of her hull below the waterline, a manoeuvre that leaves a heavily armed pirate ship completely helpless, unable to fight or flee for as long as the work takes. Every man not standing watch spends the next several days scraping barnacles and shipworm off wet, tar-black timber under a punishing sun, breathing fumes off the pitch being melted down to reseal her seams. Hands blistered and split before the first day is even finished. It is filthy, exhausting, unglamorous labour, the kind no pirate story ever bothers to mention, and it is also, without a shred of exaggeration, the single most important job the crew does all year. A hull fouled with weed and worm loses speed, loses manoeuvrability, and eventually loses seaworthiness altogether. The men who complain loudest about careening are, without exception, the same men who would complain far louder about drowning in a ship too slow to outrun a Royal Navy frigate. Here's the thing about pirate life nobody tells you. For every hour spent taking a prize at gunpoint, there are a dozen spent on maintenance that looks a great deal like ordinary backbreaking work. What happens below decks after dark on a ship this crowded is a different matter entirely. And we'll get to it. But not yet. For now, the fleet keeps moving north along the American coast, taking prizes as it goes, restocking rum and rations and gunpowder, and somewhere in all of it, Thomas Davis keeps his head down, keeps his tools sharp, and keeps surviving one watch at a time. He doesn't know it yet, but of every man aboard the wider galley in the spring of 1717, he is one of only two who is going to live long enough to tell anyone what any of this was actually like. Hold on to him. We'll need him again before the night is over. That question of who ends up in command and why is where this story turns from Davis's quiet survival to the far louder story of the man giving the orders, and it turns out the two are connected, because the very system that gave Davis his fair share of stolen shirts is also the system that put Samuel Bellamy in charge of a fleet in the first place. Picture the moment first, because it's a better opening than any biography. Late in 1716, aboard a ship commanded by a veteran pirate named Benjamin Hornigold, a crew of roughly 100 armed, frustrated men gathered on deck to do something almost no navy on earth allowed its sailors to do. They held a vote on whether to keep their captain. Hornigold, for reasons of personal loyalty nobody aboard particularly respected, had refused for months to attack English shipping, sparing vessels flying the flag he'd once served under even as French and Dutch ships went undefended past him. His crew, most of whom were in this for money and not patriotism, had had enough. They put it to a vote. Hornigold lost. A younger, more aggressive sailor named Samuel Bellamy, along with his partner, a Rhode Island silversmith turned pirate named Palsgrave Williams, was elected captain in his place, and roughly 90 of Hornigold's own men chose to sail with the new leadership rather than stay loyal to the man who'd just been voted out from under them. This is the story of Samuel Bellamy, the sailor who was hired for a job, then elected to a better one, entirely by the votes of men who could just as easily have voted him back off the deck a month later. Bellamy was born around February of 1689, most likely in the village of Hittersley in Devon, England, and almost nothing reliable survives about his life before he turns up on the historical record as a young sailor working the Caribbean and the North Atlantic in the mid-1710s. Everything before that, a stint in the Royal Navy, a failed attempt at treasure hunting off the Florida coast, a romance with a Cape Cod girl named Maria, sometimes called Goody, Hallett, comes to us second-hand, filtered through decades of local folklore, and some of it almost certainly isn't true in the way it gets told. We'll flag that carefully as we go, because it matters. What is documented through court records, colonial governors' correspondence, and ship captains' sworn depositions rather than campfire legend, is what Bellamy did once he had a fleet under him. He and Williams, working in tandem, ran down at least 53 vessels over roughly a year of active piracy, an astonishing clip for a career that barely lasted 14 months from election to shipwreck. Here's where the legend and the record start to blur, and it's worth walking through carefully, because it's the exact kind of claim tonight's accuracy rules ask us to slow down on. According to folklore first written down generations after Bellamy's death, he'd fallen in love with a young Eastern woman named Maria Hallett before he ever went to sea, promised to return wealthy enough to marry her, and was sailing north along the Cape Cod coast that April specifically to find her again, with the storm that killed him arriving in the most theatrical version of the tale, almost as poetic punishment. It's a wonderful story. It is also almost entirely undocumented outside of 19th and 20th century retellings, and no contemporary court record, deposition, or governor's letter from 1717 mentions Maria Hallett by name. Historians who study the wreck treat her as folklore layered onto the record after the fact, the kind of romantic explanation a community invents over a century of retelling for why a ship happened to wreck exactly where it did. We'll come back to her, because Cape Cod never quite let her go, but we're telling you now, clearly what follows about Bellamy's love life is legend, not documented history, and it should be held that way. What is far better documented is the reputation Bellamy earned among the sailors he captured, which is where Black Sam and the Prince of Pirates nicknames actually come from, not his hair colour, though contemporary accounts do describe him wearing his dark hair loose and tied back, rather than in the powdered wig fashionable among gentlemen of the day, but his conduct toward prisoners. The most famous illustration of it comes from a captured sloop captain named Beer, whose vessel Bellamy's crew voted to burn after Beer refused an offer to join them. Bellamy, by the account preserved in Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 General History of the Pirates, a book we need to treat carefully all night, since its authorship is disputed and it's known to have dramatised dialogue no living witness could have recorded, reportedly told Beer he was sorry the men wouldn't let him keep his sloop. Since he took no pleasure in doing anyone an unnecessary mischief, the ship simply had to be burned, and Beer was welcome to make what use he could of the wreckage. Treat the exact wording as legend. Treat the underlying reputation as real. Multiple independent captured captains, across multiple encounters, described being released rather than harmed, which is precisely the kind of pattern that turns a working pirate into a folk hero. For a stretch of 1716, Bellamy also sailed in loose company with other pirates, whose names would go on to eclipse his own in popular memory, and the overlap is worth a moment, because it places him squarely inside a much larger, interconnected world, rather than as an isolated figure. He and Williams reportedly worked alongside a French pirate named Olivier Levasseur, later notorious in his own right along the Indian Ocean trade routes, taking several merchant vessels together in the Virgin Islands before their paths diverged. Hornigold, the captain Bellamy's crew had just voted out, had at various points sailed in the same loose Bahamas-based fraternity of pirates that also included a former proch of his own, a sailor named Edward Teach, who would go on to become globally infamous as Blackbeard. None of these men operated under a single command or a formal alliance. The pirate republic based out of Nassau in this period was closer to a rough temporary fellowship of independent operators who occasionally combined forces, traded intelligence, and drank together in the same waterfront taverns than to any organised fleet. Bellamy's rise, in other words, didn't happen in isolation. It happened inside a genuine community of outlaws who knew each other, competed with each other, and occasionally saved each other's lives, which makes his final solitary night off Cape Cod, with Williams gone to Rhode Island and every other ally scattered along 1,000 miles of coastline, feel considerably lonelier in hindsight than it might have felt to Bellamy himself in the moment. By early 1717, Robin Hood's men, the nickname Bellamy's own crew, reportedly gave themselves, according to the same disputed but influential Johnson account, had grown from Hornigold's original 100 into a genuine small fleet, the Wider as flagship after her capture. A prize galley renamed the Anne under a captain called Richard Noland, with a crew of about 28, and Williams's own sloop the Marianne working in loose coordination alongside them. Bellamy had gone, in under a year, from a sailor on someone else's ship to the elected commander of a multi-vessel operation carrying, by the surviving accounts of the men who lived through its final night, something in the neighbourhood of 4.5 tons of gold, silver and jewellery, a fortune that some modern estimates place in the range of $100 million or more today, though any such conversion across 3 centuries of currency should be taken as a rough, disputed approximation rather than a hard figure. What little is known of Bellamy's appearance comes almost entirely from descriptions written by the men who survived encountering him, and it paints a portrait considerably more theatrical than the plain working sailor his background suggests. Contemporary accounts describe him favouring black velvet waistcoats and knee breeches, silk stockings, and shoes finished with silver buckles, a wardrobe closer to a well-off gentleman's than a common seaman's, financed, presumably, by the same 53 captured vessels that funded everything else about his short career. He's also described carrying no fewer than 4 dueling pistols thrust through a silk sash at all times, along with a sword, an arsenal that reads less like practical self-defence and more like a walking advertisement for exactly how successful this particular pirate had become. By the time of his death at 28 years old, Bellamy had accumulated, by some later reckonings, a personal fortune worth well over $100 million in modern terms, an almost absurd sum for a man who by every surviving account began his working life as an unremarkable sailor, with no fortune, no title, and no particular prospects at all. Here's the thing about a 14-month career that ends in a shipwreck. It's long enough to become one of the richest men in the Atlantic world, and nowhere near long enough to spend any of it. There's a bitter kind of symmetry worth pointing out here, because the man Bellamy's crew voted out of command didn't share his replacement's fate. Benjamin Hornigold, deposed by his own men in 1716 for refusing to attack English shipping, went on to accept a royal pardon the following year when the newly appointed governor of the Bahamas, Woodes Rogers, arrived in Nassau offering amnesty to any pirate willing to give up the trade. Hornigold took the deal and spent his final working years hunting down his former colleagues as a licensed pirate hunter in England's service, the same loyalty that had cost him his command among Bellamy's crew, ultimately buying him a longer, quieter life than piracy ever offered the men who replaced him. Bellamy, the aggressive young captain elected specifically because he was willing to do what Hornigold wouldn't, never lived to see that pardon offered. He was dead within the year, along with nearly everyone who'd voted for him. Democracy, on a pirate ship, decided who was in charge. It never once decided who survived. It's worth spending one more segment on Maria Hallett, not because the record supports her, but because the legend itself is a genuinely interesting piece of Cape Cod history in its own right. And understanding how it grew tells you something about how folklore works. Over the 2 centuries following the wreck, local storytellers built an increasingly elaborate mythology around an Eastern girl said to have loved Bellamy, been left pregnant when he sailed off in search of treasure, lost the child, been shunned by her community, and finally taken to living alone in a hut on the very dunes where the Wider eventually wrecked, earning her, in some tellings, the nickname the Witch of Wellfleet, a woman blamed by suspicious neighbours for calling the storm down on her former lover's ship out of grief or spite. It's a genuinely good story, with a shape almost too neat to be true, which is usually the first warning sign that it isn't. No governor's letter, no court deposition, no contemporary newspaper account from 1717 mentions her by name, and the earliest written versions of her story only start appearing in local histories more than a century after the wreck. What can be said with confidence is that Cape Cod communities have been telling some version of this story for longer than the United States has existed. Which means whatever else it isn't nothing. It's simply not history in the sense tonight's other facts are history. Treat her the way generations of Wellfleet storytellers clearly wanted her treated, as folklore worth knowing, held at careful arm's length from everything documented alongside it. It's worth adding one note of realism to the Robin Hood picture before we move on, because mercy and self-interest were rarely fully separate motives for a working pirate captain. Releasing a captured crew rather than killing them, or offering them a genuine choice to join rather than forcing the issue at knife point, wasn't purely generosity, it was also good business. A captain with a reputation for slaughtering captured sailors gave every future prize every reason to fight to the death rather than surrender, which meant more casualties, more damaged ships, and less usable plunder on Bellamy's own side of the ledger. A captain known for letting cooperative captains sail away unharmed, by contrast, encouraged exactly the kind of quick, bloodless surrender that kept prizes intact and kept Bellamy's own crew alive to enjoy their shares. None of that makes the mercy less real, or less remarkable set against the routine brutality plenty of Bellamy's contemporaries practiced instead. It simply means the Prince of Pirates was, in this respect as in most others, a genuinely shrewd operator as much as a genuinely kind one, and it's rarely possible 3 centuries later to fully untangle which motive was doing more of the work in any single documented act of mercy. It's worth pausing on the sheer pace of it, because 14 months is a strange compressed span of time to build and lose an entire life inside. Bellamy was elected captain of Hornigold's mutinying crew sometime in the final months of 1716, and he was dead by the following April, meaning every part of the story this chapter tells: the 53 captured ships, the multiplying fleet, the fortune worth 9 figures by modern reckoning, the nickname that would outlive him by 3 centuries, happened inside a period of time shorter than a single American football season. Most successful careers, criminal or otherwise, take years to build the kind of reputation Bellamy earned in barely more than one. Whatever else can be said about the Prince of Pirates, he did not waste his time. The nickname his crew reportedly chose for themselves, Gentlemen of Fortune, is worth a beat of its own, because it captures something genuine about how these men seem to have understood their own work. Not thieves, not murderers, men whose fortune had simply taken an unconventional path, earned through risk and cooperation rather than birth or inheritance, in a century that offered a labourer's son almost no other route to real wealth at all. It's self-mythology, certainly, dressing up armed robbery in the language of enterprise. But it's also not entirely wrong. A poor Devon-born sailor with no title and no prospects became, within a single year, wealthier than most members of the aristocracy he'd been born beneath. The system he used to get there was illegal, violent, and built on theft. It was also, by the standards of almost every other path available to a man of his birth in 1717, considerably more open to him than anything waiting on land. None of it would matter within a matter of weeks. But it's worth pausing here, before the fleet turns north for the last time, to notice what actually built that fortune and that command. Not conquest in the traditional sense, but consent. A vote removed Hornigold. A vote installed Bellamy. And every man aboard every ship in that fleet, from the newest forced carpenter to the captain himself, operated under a written system of rules that the crew, not the captain, had the final power to enforce or overturn. We haven't looked closely at those rules yet. It's time we did, because they're the reason this story has more warmth in it than a story about armed robbery at sea has any right to contain. Before you're allowed below decks as anything more than a prisoner, someone hands you a sheet of paper, or more likely reads it aloud to you, because a fair number of the men aboard can't read at all. This is the ship's articles, the written constitution every crew member, forced or free, is expected to sign or mark before he's considered a full member of the company rather than cargo. You've been aboard 3 days by now, still deciding whether cooperation is survival or surrender, and this document is where you find out exactly what you're agreeing to. This system didn't spring up overnight, and it's worth a segment on where it actually came from, because it makes the whole apparatus feel less like an invention and more like an inheritance. Golden Age pirate articles descend directly from an older buccaneer custom called the chasse party, or charter party. A written profit-sharing agreement Caribbean raiders had been drawing up among themselves since the mid-1600s, decades before Bellamy was even born. Those early agreements had, in some Jamaican ports, briefly carried something close to actual legal standing, recognised informally by colonial courts eager to regulate a lucrative semi-official raiding economy that blurred the line between piracy and privateering. By the time the practice reached Bellamy's generation, it had evolved into the fuller written constitutions historians now call articles, more detailed, more democratic, and considerably more concerned with fairness among the crew than the earlier charter parties had needed to be, since a captain in 1717 was recruiting almost entirely from forced men and desperate volunteers, rather than from established raiding companies with reputations to protect. In other words, the fairness wasn't an accident or a sentimental flourish. It was a practical necessity, built up over 3 generations of trial and error, for holding together a crew of armed, dangerous men with no other legal or social structure keeping them from turning on each other or on their own captain. No single copy of the Wider's own articles has survived. Ships burned them, lost them, or simply never wrote them down in a form that outlived the crew. What has survived, preserved almost word for word in court records and in Johnson's general history, are the articles of Bartholomew Roberts, a contemporary of Bellamy's operating on the same broad model most Golden Age pirate crews used, and historians treat them as the clearest surviving window into what a document like the one you're signing actually said. So let's use them as our guide, understanding that Bellamy's own crew almost certainly worked from something close to the same template. Article the First. Every man has an equal vote in matters of importance. Not the captain's vote weighted more heavily than anyone else's, one man, one vote, on questions like which ship to chase, whether to accept a surrender, where to make landfall next. You've never had a vote in your working life before this. The merchant captain who employed you before you were taken didn't ask his crew's opinion on anything. Here you get a say in whether the fleet fights or runs. It's a strange kind of freedom to receive at gunpoint. Article the Second, roughly, every man is called fairly, in his turn by list, to board a captured prize and take first pick of goods before the larger division of plunder, the same rotation that put Thomas Davis in an oversized coat a chapter ago. Steal from a shipmate, though, and the penalty is severe, your nose and ears slit as a permanent public mark, then set ashore somewhere you're likely to survive, but never trusted again. The pirate version of a company that fires you for expense report fraud, except the exit interview leaves scars. A month into your voyage, the quartermaster is called on to settle a dispute between 2 men who can't agree on who insulted whom first, and you watch the process unfold exactly as the articles describe it. No striking one another aboard ship, under any circumstance. That offence alone can mean serious punishment, because a fight below decks in close quarters, with knives and hundreds of men crammed together, is exactly the kind of chaos this crew cannot afford. Instead, the quarrel is carried ashore. The quartermaster walks the 2 men out, places them back to back at a set number of paces, and on his word, they turn and fire. If both miss, they finish it with cutlasses, and whoever draws first blood is declared satisfied. It is violent. It is also, notably, not murder. It's a regulated, witnessed, rule-bound process, closer to a legal duel than a knife fight in an alley. Here's what nobody tells you about a pirate crew. It isn't chaos. It's a system that happens to be run by outlaws. And then there's the article that tells you the most about what this crew actually believed it owed its own men. Any pirate who loses a limb or becomes permanently crippled in the ship's service is entitled to a fixed payment from the common treasury before any other division of spoils happens, by the surviving figures from Roberts's crew. 800 pieces of 8 for the loss of a leg or an arm, proportionally less for a finger or an eye. Put that number in perspective. 800 pieces of 8 was for an ordinary sailor of the period, several years' worth of honest wages, paid out not as charity but as a contractual right, agreed to in writing before anyone got hurt. It is, by any reasonable definition, an insurance policy worked out and enforced by armed outlaws roughly a century before any legitimate merchant marine offered its sailors anything comparable. You signed onto a ship that will hunt you down for stealing a shirt and simultaneously guarantee you a settlement if a cannonball takes your leg off. Try explaining that combination to a modern insurance adjuster. The articles cover territory considerably stranger than violence and theft, and it's worth sitting with a few of the odder provisions, because they tell you something about what this crew actually valued in its day-to-day life. Lights and open flame were to be extinguished by 8 in the evening under most versions of the articles, with any man wanting to keep drinking past that hour required to do it up on the open deck rather than below decks, where a spilled lantern near stored gunpowder could kill everyone aboard in an instant. Musicians and pirate crews of the period nearly always carried at least one or two, fiddlers and drummers mostly, captured along with everything else from a prize ship's crew, were guaranteed rest on the Sabbath, one single day out of 7 when nobody could demand they play. It's a small, almost tender detail buried inside a document mostly concerned with violence and money. A crew of armed robbers who nonetheless wrote down, in ink, that the men providing their entertainment deserved 1 day of rest a week. No merchant captain of the period was contractually obligated to give his crew anything of the sort. The math of shares is worth walking through plainly, because it clarifies exactly how radical this system was next to legitimate maritime employment of the era. Under the surviving articles, the captain and quartermaster typically drew 2 shares of any prize. Officers like the master gunner and boatswain drew a share and a half, and every ordinary crew member, the men Bellamy's own company reportedly called Gentlemen of Fortune, drew 1 full share apiece, the same cut, forced man or free, English or African or Dutch or Mosquito. Compare that to Royal Navy pay of the same period, where an ordinary seaman might earn something like 19 shillings a month, while his captain took home a salary many multiples higher, plus a formal share of any prize money that dwarfed anything his crew received. A pirate ship's captain earned, at most, twice what his newest hand earned. A navy captain might earn 20 times what his newest hand earned for the exact same voyage, the exact same danger, the exact same distance from home. It is not an accident that so many merchant and naval sailors of the period, given the choice at the point of a cutlass, chose to sign the articles rather than sail on. Not every man taken off a captured ship ends up signing at all, and that distinction turns out to matter enormously later in this story, so it's worth explaining now. Pirate crews of this period generally understood, in a rough working sense, the difference between a genuinely useful specialist worth pressing into service, a carpenter, a surgeon, a navigator, and an ordinary passenger or crewman who had nothing particular to offer and no particular reason to be kept against his will. The latter were, more often than not, simply released along with whatever ship or portion of a ship the crew decided not to keep, sometimes given a small stake of supplies or coin for the trouble. The men who were kept, like Thomas Davis, understood on some level that their skill was the very thing keeping them alive, which produced a strange, uncomfortable kind of gratitude mixed in with the resentment. Grateful to be needed, resentful at needing to be. It's a distinction that will matter enormously in a Boston courtroom several months from now, because a colonial court trying to determine whether a captured pirate had been forced or willing looked precisely at evidence like this. Was this man's skill the reason he was kept aboard? Or did he take up arms and share in the plunder like any volunteer? The line between prisoner and pirate, in other words, was never drawn once at the moment of capture. It was drawn again and again, every single day a man remained aboard, by the choices he made once he was there. Not everyone who signs the articles comes aboard the way you did. Some, astonishingly, asked to join. The clearest documented case belongs to a boy named John King, and his story is worth pulling out of the general crowd, because it's one of the few moments in this entire voyage that historians can trace back to a sworn statement rather than legend. In November of 1716, Bellamy's crew captured a small Antigua-bound sloop called the Bonetta out of Jamaica. Among the passengers were a woman and her son, a boy somewhere between 8 and 11 years old named John King, travelling well-dressed, in fine stockings and an expensive imported shoe, the kind of detail that only matters later, and we'll come back to why. According to a sworn deposition filed weeks afterward by the Bonetta's captain Abijah Savage with the governor of Antigua, young King watched the pirates loot the ship for 15 days and decided, with a child's absolute conviction, that this was the life he wanted. He is recorded as declaring he would kill himself if he was kept from joining the crew, and, in the detail that makes this deposition almost unbearable to read even 3 centuries later, that he threatened harm against his own mother if she tried to stop him. Bellamy, after what the record implies was some reluctance, let the boy come aboard. It's worth understanding exactly who John King was before that November afternoon, because the detail sharpens what he gave up. The stockings and imported shoe recorded in Captain Savage's deposition weren't incidental description. They were evidence of a comfortable, likely well-off English family, the kind that could afford to send a young son across the Atlantic in fine clothing, presumably toward relatives or a planned apprenticeship somewhere in the colonies. Whatever life had been arranged for him almost certainly didn't involve rigging, cannon fire, or an unmarked grave off the Massachusetts coast. Savage's sworn account is unusually specific for a document of this kind, precise enough that historians treat it as considerably more reliable than the dramatized dialogue found in Johnson's General History. This was a ship's captain filing a formal report to a colonial governor, with real legal consequences riding on its accuracy, not a storyteller working from second-hand rumour decades later. That specificity is exactly why the story holds up as one of the best documented details of the entire Bellamy voyage, and exactly why it hurts as much as it does. This isn't legend softened by retelling, it's a mother's worst afternoon, recorded in a government archive because a stranger happened to be nearby with an obligation to write it down. Nobody knows exactly what John King's mother said in the moments after that, or what happened to her afterward, because the record simply moves on without her. What we do know is that a child not yet old enough, by most estimates, to be a teenager, spent the last several months of his short life as a working member of one of the most successful pirate crews in the Atlantic, drawing whatever partial share the articles allowed a boy his age, climbing rigging built for grown men, present for at least one of the largest captures of Bellamy's career. There is something aching in the gap between what King thought he was choosing and what he was actually signing up for, and we're going to sit in that gap again before the night is over, because his fate closes a circle that starts right here, on the day he begged to stay. Not every pirate crew of the era used identical numbers, and it's worth noting the variation, because it shows these weren't a single rigid rulebook copied ship to ship, but a genuine evolving tradition each crew adapted to its own circumstances. Aboard Edward Lowe's ship, a contemporary of Bellamy's operating on a broadly similar model, the articles specified the captain would draw 2 full shares, the master 1.5, and the doctor, mate, gunner and boatswain 1.25 shares each, with the rest of the crew splitting the remainder evenly, numbers close to but not identical to the scale Roberts's crew used a few years later. Henry Every, whose own record-setting haul decades earlier had helped establish the whole tradition of shared plunder in the first place, ran an even flatter structure still. 2 shares for the captain, 1 apiece for everyone else, no distinct officer tier at all. Bellamy's own crew almost certainly ran some close variant of one of these models, adjusted to their own captain's temperament and their own quartermaster's preferences. The point was never the specific numbers. The point was that the numbers existed at all, agreed to in advance, in writing, by men with no legal system anywhere in the world willing to enforce a single word of it for them. The single punishment every pirate aboard feared more than the noose was marooning, and it's worth understanding exactly why. Rather than execution, a serious violation of the articles, desertion in the face of battle, gross cowardice, certain categories of theft from the company, could be punished by putting a man ashore on some deserted, uninhabited stretch of coast or tiny island, left with nothing more than a pistol, a single load of powder and shot, and perhaps a jug of water, and simply sailing away. It sounds, on its face, less severe than hanging. In practice, across much of the Caribbean and Atlantic coastline of the period, it usually amounted to a slower, considerably more frightening version of the same sentence: death by exposure, starvation, or simply despair, with the single pistol charge more often used on oneself than on any game worth hunting. Crews understood this. The threat of marooning functioned less as a punishment routinely carried out, and more as the sharpest possible deterrent a crew could hold over its own members, precisely because everyone aboard had heard enough stories about who never made it back from an island like that to take the threat seriously, without anyone needing to demonstrate it twice. That's the whole shape of pirate law in one document, really. Democratic in its votes, brutal in its punishments, and, in its own strange way, more generous to the ordinary sailor than almost any legitimate maritime employer of the era. A man could lose an ear for stealing a shirt and still collect a guaranteed settlement for losing a leg in battle. A boy could threaten his own mother and still be handed a place at the table. The articles didn't make anyone safe. They made the danger, for the first time in most of these men's working lives, something that came with a written promise attached to it. Hold on to that promise. It's about to be tested by something no article on any pirate ship ever accounted for: the weather. By the spring of 1717, Bellamy's fleet had grown into something closer to a small navy than a single raiding ship, and the story of that fleet, what it was made of, who commanded which vessel, and how it slowly, almost accidentally, arranged itself into exactly the wrong formation on exactly the wrong night, deserves to be told as its own chapter, because ships have arcs too, not just the men who sail them. Start with a scene most historians agree actually happened roughly as described, because it's preserved in multiple later depositions rather than in Johnson's more theatrical general history alone. On the morning of April 26, 1717, somewhere off the elbow of Cape Cod, near what would later be called Chatham, lookouts on Bellamy's ships spotted a two-masted Pink, a broad-sterned merchant vessel, called the Mary Ann, riding low in the water under a cargo of more than 7,000 gallons of Madeira wine, bound for the colonies. The chase was short. The Mary Ann's captain, Andrew Crumpsty, surrendered without much of a fight, and by early afternoon Bellamy's men had taken a second prize as well, a small sloop called the Fisher, carrying deer hides and tobacco. It should have been an ordinary, profitable day. Instead, it turned out to be the last full day nearly everyone aboard the wider galley would ever see. This is the story of a fleet, not a single ship, but 4 of them, sailing in loose company up the New England coast, and the way that company quietly, catastrophically dissolved in the space of a single foggy evening. One incident from earlier in the voyage deserves a fuller telling here, because it's one of the clearest documented windows into the tension between Bellamy's personal instincts and his crew's collective vote. Somewhere off the Chesapeake Bay, Bellamy's fleet took a sloop under a captain named Beers, and by the account preserved in Johnson's general history, Bellamy genuinely wanted to let the man sail away with his vessel intact, the same mercy he'd shown Lawrence Prince months earlier. His crew, working under the same democratic articles that had elected him captain in the first place, overruled him. Beers had refused an offer to join the pirate company, and the company, by majority vote, decided his ship would be burned regardless of what their captain preferred. It's a small, telling moment. Even Bellamy, riding the height of his reputation as the merciful prince of pirates, didn't have the authority to override a vote he personally disagreed with. The same system that gave an ordinary forced sailor a say in the ship's course gave that same sailor the power to overrule a captain's private wishes. Democracy cuts in every direction at once, and Bellamy, whatever his instincts, was bound by it same as anyone. Not every ship the fleet encountered that spring ended up burned, captured, or kept, and the smaller. Less dramatic decisions are worth a moment, because they round out the picture of how this operation actually ran. A vessel called the Agnes, taken sometime in the weeks before the final storm, was inspected and released rather than kept, judged too poorly maintained or too slow to be worth the trouble of crewing. Pirates, whatever else they were, ran a business. And a business doesn't hold on to unprofitable assets simply because it can. The Anne, a captured prize galley Bellamy did choose to keep, sailed under the command of a man named Richard Noland with a crew of roughly 28, operating in loose coordination with the main fleet rather than glued to its side. On the night of April 26th, that looseness turned out to be the difference between life and death. The Anne, further out to sea and further removed from the coastal course the Wider was following, rode out the same storm that destroyed Bellamy's flagship, largely unscathed. 28 men lived because their ship happened to be sailing a slightly different line through the same ocean that night. There's no moral in that, exactly, there's just weather and distance, and the particular cruelty of how close a single evening's decisions can come to mattering everything or nothing at all. Palsgrave Williams himself is worth a moment before he sails out of this story entirely, because his path into piracy looked nothing like Bellamy's. Where Bellamy came up through the ordinary, largely undocumented life of a working sailor, Williams was a trained silversmith from a comfortable Rhode Island family, a man with an established trade and a home to return to who chose piracy anyway. Reportedly drawn, like Bellamy, by tales of Spanish treasure recoverable off the Florida coast, and never fully turning back once the two men joined forces. It's a reminder that not everyone aboard these ships was fleeing poverty or the lash of a merchant captain. Some came looking for exactly what Bellamy found, and Williams's decision to peel off toward Rhode Island days before the storm, whether for family, for supplies, or simply for a change of scenery, turned out to be the one decision in this entire story that a person actually got to make freely and live to enjoy the consequences of. He would go on, after Bellamy's death, to continue a pirate's working life for a while longer, before eventually fading from the historical record, never captured, never tried, never hanged. Of everyone tied closely to this story, Williams may be the only one who simply walked away and kept walking. By April of 1717, that fleet had already been through changes worth understanding before we get to its final night. Palsgrave Williams, Bellamy's longtime partner and co-captain, had parted ways with the main group sometime earlier to visit family in Rhode Island, taking his own sloop out of the immediate formation, a decision that, whatever his reasons, meant he would not be aboard for what came next, and would go on, after Bellamy's death, to continue a pirate's life for a while longer under considerably less scrutiny than the men who drowned that April. The Anne, under Richard Noland's command with roughly 24 men aboard, had also drifted somewhat separate from Bellamy's immediate company by this point in the voyage. What remained sailing in close formation as dusk fell on April 26th was the Wider herself, with something like 146 to 180 men aboard, depending on which account you trust, trailing not far behind the newly captured Mary Ann. Now crewed by a mixed prize crew of Bellamy's own pirates and several of the original merchant sailors, including a forced Welsh carpenter named Thomas South, who by his later account hoped to slip away and swim for shore the moment land came close enough. Here's the detail that turns an ordinary evening into a genuine historical hinge point. And it's the kind of detail sailors of the period would have understood instantly, and that we, 3 centuries removed from square-rig navigation, need to have explained to us. As the sun went down that evening, the wind died almost entirely, and a thick fog rolled in off the water, the specific, ominous combination New England mariners have long recognised as the classic warning sign of an approaching nor'easter, the kind of Atlantic storm system capable, even without a name or a modern hurricane classification, of producing hurricane force winds along the coast. In that fog, with no wind to hold formation and no visibility to signal one another, Bellamy's ships lost sight of each other entirely. The fleet that had sailed together all day scattered into darkness, each vessel now alone with whatever the night was about to bring. We should pause here and be honest about something the popular version of this story often gets wrong. Because a persistent legend claims the pirates were simply too drunk on captured wine to navigate safely that night, a colourful detail that shows up in a great deal of retelling, but isn't solidly documented in the surviving court records themselves, and reads more like the kind of moralising flourish a 19th century storyteller would add to explain a tragedy after the fact. What is documented is considerably less about carelessness and considerably more about bad luck stacked on bad timing, a genuinely violent, fast-forming storm system, a sudden fog that erased visibility exactly when the fleet needed it most, and a coastline, the outer arm of Cape Cod, notorious among sailors of the era for its shifting sandbars, that offered almost no margin for error, even in calm conditions. Somewhere in the fading light before the fog closed in completely, Bellamy made a decision that every account agrees on, whatever his reasons, rather than standing well out to sea, where deep water would have given his ships room to ride out a storm without fear of running aground. He kept the wider relatively close along the coastline, following behind the captured Marianne, likely trying to keep her prize crew in sight for as long as visibility allowed. It was a reasonable decision made with the information available at the time. It would turn out to be the decision that put a 300-ton ship on a collision course with a sandbar in the dark in 50-mile-an-hour wind within a matter of hours. It's worth understanding one more practical limitation working against Bellamy's fleet that night, because it explains a great deal about how 4 ships that had spent the whole day within sight of each other could vanish from one another's view so completely, so fast. Sailors of 1717 had no reliable way to fix their longitude at sea. The marine chronometer that would eventually solve that problem was still decades from invention, which meant every ship's navigator was working from dead reckoning, estimated speed, estimated heading, and elapsed time, corrected as best as possible against landmarks and known depths whenever the coast came into view. In clear conditions, close to a coastline as familiar as the American seaboard had become to men who'd sailed it for months, that method worked well enough. In sudden fog, with the wind dying and visibility collapsing to a few dozen yards, it worked barely at all. 4 ships that had been sailing an identical course within hailing distance of each other that morning were, by full dark, each essentially guessing at where the others actually were, and, more dangerously, each guessing at exactly how close to the treacherous Outer Cape shoreline their own ship actually sat. It wasn't recklessness that put the wider on that sandbar. It was the honest limit of what 18th century navigation could promise anyone, pirate or otherwise, on a night when the ocean simply stopped cooperating. There's a small, dark joke buried in the timing of that last full day, worth allowing yourself before the mood turns for good and stays turned. The 2 prizes taken on April 26th were a ship loaded with more than 7,000 gallons of Madeira wine and a sloop loaded with deer hides and tobacco. In other words, the entire fleet spent its final ordinary afternoon acquiring in bulk the ingredients for a celebration that never got to happen. Whatever the popular legend says about drunkenness contributing to the wreck, the wine itself is real, sitting in barrels in a captured hold, waiting for men who would be dead within 12 hours to get around to drinking it. Sometimes history hands you an irony too on the nose to need any embellishment at all. By full dark, the fleet that had captured 2 prizes and enjoyed a profitable ordinary day was 4 separate vessels, alone in fog, with the barometer falling and the wind about to come back with a vengeance nobody aboard any of them had fully reckoned with. The Anne and Williams's sloop, further out and further along in their own separate business, would ride out what was coming largely unscathed. The Marianne, running close along the coast, was about to run herself directly onto a sandbar of her own, and, in one of the night's few small mercies, hold together on it rather than break apart, giving her crew a fighting chance the Wider's crew would not get, and the Wider herself trailing behind, low and heavy with 4.5 tons of stolen gold and silver in her hold, cannons run out along both sides, and something close to 146 men aboard, most of them now trying, in the ordinary human way, to get some sleep before their watch came round again, was sailing directly into the worst storm to hit the New England coast in living memory. It's worth understanding, before the storm itself arrives in full, exactly what kind of weather system New England sailors of the period were up against. because a nor'easter carries none of the modern warning apparatus a hurricane does and can still deliver comparable violence. Unlike a tropical hurricane which forms over warm ocean water and can be tracked for days as it organizes and strengthens, a nor'easter forms along the boundary where cold continental air collides with the relatively warmer waters of the Gulf Stream, and it can intensify with startling speed, a calm evening curdling into sustained gale-force wind within a matter of hours. With almost no advance warning available to a wooden ship relying on nothing more sophisticated than a falling barometer and a sailor's own gut instinct for changing pressure. Reconstructions of the April 1717 storm, built from surviving colonial correspondence and damage reports up and down the coast, place it in the range of what a modern meteorologist would call a Category 1 hurricane in sustained force, arriving with essentially none of the infrastructure that gives today's coastal residents days of warning. Bellamy's fleet had at most a few hours' notice in the form of a dying wind and a thickening fog. That was the entire early warning system available to well over 100 men whose lives were about to depend on it. It also helps to understand that the Wider wasn't unlucky so much as she was sailing into a stretch of ocean with a long, well-earned reputation for exactly this kind of ending. The outer arm of Cape Cod sits atop a shifting network of sandbars built and rebuilt constantly by current and storm, invisible from a ship's deck until the moment a keel finds one, and by some later estimates more than 3,000 vessels have wrecked along that same general stretch of coastline across the centuries mariners have sailed it. Enough that the region eventually earned its own grim nickname among sailors, the Graveyard of the Atlantic. The Wider wasn't the first ship that treacherous geography claimed, and she was nowhere near the last. She's simply the one whose wreck happened to carry the wealthiest pirate crew of the era, which is the only reason her particular sandbar, out of thousands along that same coast, still has a name people remember 300 years later. Relief that it isn't you tonight is not a small thing. Whatever you're lying on right now, a mattress, a couch, the floor with a blanket, it is not currently pitching 30 feet on a swell in freezing April water with 145 other men who don't know yet that most of them have less than an hour left to live. Let's go find out, in as much detail as the survivors left us, exactly what that hour sounded like from inside the hold. You're lying in the Wider's hold sometime after midnight, and the first thing you notice, before anything else, is the smell, tar, bilge, wet rope, and under it, faintly the mineral tang of the coins packed in canvas sacks somewhere nearby. 180 of them by some later accounts, each one weighing close to 50 pounds. You've been off watch for 2 hours. You're exhausted in the specific way sailors get exhausted, bone-deep and dreamless, and the ship's ordinary motion, the creak and roll every man aboard has long since stopped consciously hearing, has almost lulled you into real sleep. Almost. Go back a few hours first, to somewhere around 8 in the evening, before the worst of it arrives, because the way this storm built matters as much as the way it struck. The wind that had died to nothing at sunset doesn't return gradually. Survivors' accounts, filtered through later depositions and reconstructed by historians working from colonial storm damage records up and down the coast, describe conditions shifting with almost no transition, flat calm, then a rising moan in the rigging then, within what felt like minutes, sustained gale-force wind strong enough to knock a standing man off his feet on an open deck. Somewhere in that transition, whoever held the watch would have felt the storm's warning in the oldest way sailors of the period had available to them, a change in the wind's smell, a metallic taste some describe in cold storm-charged air, an ache in old injuries that every experienced seaman learned to trust more than any instrument. By the time anyone below decks understood what was happening, the ship above them had already stopped behaving like a ship. The wind finds you before you fully understand what's coming. It arrives not as a gust but as a wall, and the change in the Wider's motion is so sudden that half the men trying to sleep around you are thrown against the timbers before they're even fully awake. Somewhere above, you hear the first mast go, a crack loud enough to be heard clearly through solid oak planking, followed by the specific, sickening sound of rigging tearing loose and canvas shredding in wind that later reconstructions place at somewhere near 70 miles an hour. You're on your feet now, one hand braced against a beam, and you understand, with the flat clarity that arrives in genuine emergencies, that whatever is happening above you is worse than anything you've lived through in your months aboard this ship. By the time the second mast goes, perhaps 20 minutes later, the hold has become something closer to a drum than a room. Every wave slamming the hull sends a shudder through the whole structure, and men are shouting orders and prayers in roughly equal measure, in English, in Dutch, in languages you don't recognise, all of it barely audible over the storm itself. Waves that survivors and colonial officials later estimated at 30 to 40 feet are breaking over a deck that no longer has the sail area to run before them, and the wider, heavy with cargo and cannon, is being driven not out to open sea, where she might have had a chance, but directly toward the shoreline she'd been trailing along all evening. Here's what the storm actually did to a wooden ship built to survive ordinary Atlantic crossings, described as plainly as the surviving depositions allow, sometime around midnight. In the earliest hours of what every account still calls the night of April 26th, the wider struck a sandbar roughly 500 feet from the beach, in water only about 16 feet deep, at a spot that is today part of Marconi Beach in Wellfleet. The impact wasn't survivable in any meaningful sense for most of what came next. Cannon broke loose from their mountings and tore through the overturned decks. The stern, taking the brunt of successive 30-foot waves, began to break apart within minutes. The whole ship, mast, hull, hold, and every man still inside her, went from a functioning vessel to a debris field in less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud. It's worth understanding, in plain terms, why a 300-ton wooden ship comes apart the way the wider did, because she broke apart undersells exactly what that means in practice. The wooden hull of this era is held together by thousands of individual joints, planks fastened to frames with iron nails and wooden tree nails, seams packed with tarred rope fibre called oakum to keep water out, the whole structure designed to flex slightly under normal sailing stress and spring back into shape. Run that same hull hard aground on a sandbar, then hold it in place while 30 to 40 foot waves slam into it from the same direction over and over, and the flex that normally keeps a ship alive becomes the mechanism that kills her. Planks work loose from their frames one joint at a time. Seams open faster than any pump could clear the water pouring through them, and eventually the structure simply can't transfer the load anymore. The stern typically goes first in a grounding of this kind, lighter built and taking the worst of a following sea. Once it starts to separate from the rest of the hull, everything's still attached to it. Decking, cannon mounts, cargo lashings. Goes with it into the surf. This isn't a ship sinking gracefully beneath the waves the way it happens in paintings. It's closer to a building coming apart floor by floor in an earthquake, except the building is also full of seawater and hundreds of trapped panicking men. You are, in this telling, one of 146 men now in the water, or trying to get there, in conditions that made the distance to shore functionally meaningless. 500 feet is nothing on a calm day. A strong swimmer could cover it in a few minutes. In 30 to 40 foot breaking surf, in April ocean water cold enough to induce hypothermia and incapacitation within minutes. Wearing wool clothing that soaks up its own weight in seawater, 500 feet might as well be 500 miles. Men who survived the initial wreck, uninjured by falling cannon or collapsing rigging, were still, by every reasonable account, unlikely to survive the swim. Somewhere in that chaos, a boy who once threatened to hurt himself and his own mother rather than be kept from this life met the end of it. Excavation of the wreck site, nearly 300 years later, uncovered a small leather shoe of expensive imported design, a stocking of woven French silk, and a short human leg bone still inside them, later identified by a Smithsonian anthropologist and an independent maritime archaeologist as belonging to a child roughly 8 to 11 years old, the same age range recorded for John King in Captain Savage's 1716 deposition. The best reconstruction available suggests he was pinned by a falling cannon as the deck came apart around him. He was the only child recorded aboard. There is no reasonable account in which those remains belong to anyone else. Let that sit for a second without a joke attached to it, because this is exactly the kind of moment tonight's story asks us to leave unadorned. A boy who wanted this life so badly, he threatened his own mother to get it spent roughly 5 months living it, and then the ocean took him in under an hour. Pinned beneath the weight of a cannon he probably never learned to fire properly. There is no irony gentle enough to soften that, and we're not going to try. Elsewhere in the wreck, in the same chaos, 2 men were making decisions that would, against every reasonable statistical expectation, keep them alive. One was the Mosquito pilot the crew called John Julian, a 16-year-old with intimate knowledge of coastal waters, whose skill at reading current and surf may have given him a genuine edge in the swim, but killed nearly everyone else who attempted it. The other was Thomas Davis, the Welsh carpenter we met several chapters ago, still carrying, in the strange, specific way survivors sometimes describe clinging to small objects in catastrophe. Whatever instinct for careful, patient work had kept him useful, and therefore alive, this entire voyage. Both men made it through breaking surf that killed 144 others, or thereabouts, and both washed up, separately exhausted and freezing, onto a beach that belonged, as of that morning, to the Massachusetts Bay Colony's Outer Cape settlements. What actually kept those 2 men alive, as best as anyone can reconstruct from the fragments of testimony that survive, likely came down to a combination of timing and simple physical position, rather than anything more dramatic. Men trapped below decks or pinned under falling cannon and collapsing rigging had essentially no chance regardless of swimming ability. The ones who survived were, by necessity, men who were already on deck or close enough to open water when the hull gave way, thrown clear into the surf rather than crushed inside a collapsing structure. From there, survival came down to whether the sea delivered you toward the beach or pulled you further out, whether floating wreckage happened to be within reach when your strength gave out, and whether your body could withstand cold water long enough for either of those things to matter. It is not, in other words, a story about the 2 bravest or strongest men aboard beating the odds through sheer will. It's a story about 2 men who happened to be standing in slightly better positions than 144 others when the ship stopped being a ship, which is a considerably colder, more honest way to describe survival than most retellings allow for, but it's the version the evidence actually supports. Not far off, close enough that some accounts suggest the 2 crews could hear each other's distress across the storm, the Mary Ann was living through the same night with a dramatically different outcome, and the contrast is worth sitting with. She ran aground on a sandbar of her own, driven by the same wind and the same blinding fog. But her lighter construction and the angle at which she struck meant she held together rather than broke apart, battered, swamped, her crew soaked and freezing and certain for hours that they were about to die, but never actually pitched into open surf the way the Wider's crew was. By morning, all 7 pirates aboard her, plus her 3 original captured crewmen, were alive, cold and terrified, but alive. 2 ships, 1 storm, a few hundred yards of ocean between them, and 1 crew walked away nearly intact, while the other lost all but 2 of 146 men. There is no lesson in that difference worth extracting beyond the plain uncomfortable one. Sometimes surviving a catastrophe has less to do with courage or skill than with which particular patch of sandbar a ship happens to strike, and at what angle, and how she happens to be built. The ocean that night wasn't interested in fairness, it was only interested in physics. Not every man lost that night would ever be accounted for, even roughly, and that absence is its own kind of quiet horror worth naming before the sky lightens. Of something close to 146 men aboard, contemporary reports describe roughly 100 bodies eventually washing ashore in the days that followed, which means, by even the most conservative arithmetic, somewhere around 40 men simply vanished into the Atlantic entirely, taken by current, by the deep water beyond the sandbar, or by wreckage that never surfaced close enough to shore to be found at all. Samuel Bellamy himself was among that unaccounted for number. No body confidently identified as his was ever recovered in the weeks after the wreck, and for 260 years afterward. The closest thing to a grave he had was an entry in a colonial report noting that he, like so many others, simply hadn't come back. There is a particular kind of grief reserved for the people a disaster erases so completely that even mourning has nothing solid to hold on to, no body to bury, no grave to visit, only a name on a crew list and an ocean that isn't saying. Some of what we know about this night comes from nowhere more reliable than Thomas Davis's own words, delivered months later under oath in a Boston courtroom, and it's worth returning to his testimony directly here, because it's as close as this story gets to a first-hand account of the wreck itself. Davis described, according to the trial record, a ship overwhelmed with almost no warning, canvas and rigging failing in rapid succession, and a scene of total chaos in the final minutes before the hull gave way, men unable to reach the deck in time, others swept overboard by breaking water before they could attempt the swim at all. He would have had every incentive, standing before a judge who held his life in his hands, to describe himself as a helpless, terrified captive rather than an active participant in anything happening around him, and historians reading his testimony alongside the physical evidence generally find it consistent rather than self-serving. What survives of his account isn't dramatic in the way a novelist might render it. It's plain, procedural, and exhausted sounding even in transcription. A man describing the worst night of his life to strangers who would decide, based on how convincingly he described it, whether he lived or died. There's a small telling physical detail about what actually reached the beach that night versus what didn't, and it says something about the specific cruelty of how a shipwreck sorts its own wreckage. Wood floats. Canvas floats, waterlogged and slow, but eventually. Human bodies, tragically, often float as well, at least for a time. Gold and silver do not. The 4.5 tons of coin in the Wider's hold, the very cargo that made this ship worth chasing for 3 days back in the Bahamas, would have gone almost straight down the moment the hull opened, settling into the same shifting sand that was, within hours, closing over the debris field like a slow, indifferent tide of its own. The men who drowned that night, and the treasure they'd spent a year accumulating, sank by more or less the same physics, into more or less the same patch of ocean floor, and stayed there, undisturbed, for the better part of 3 centuries. It would take considerably more than a strong swimmer to bring either one back. By the time the sky began to lighten, the Wider galley. 300 tons of stolen slave ship timber, 4.5 tons of gold and silver, 28 cannon, and somewhere close to 146 men no longer existed as a ship. She existed as wreckage scattered across miles of Cape Cod shoreline, and as 2 exhausted survivors lying somewhere on that same beach, and as roughly 100 bodies that would begin washing ashore with the tide over the following hours and days. You're warm and dry right now. Remember, whatever happened to those 146 men, it isn't happening to you. Let's go find out what happened next. To the survivors, to the bodies, and to a great deal of gold that nobody aboard the Wider would ever spend. The first person to find the wreckage wasn't a colonial official or a naval officer. It was very likely a farmer or a fisherman's wife walking the outer Cape shoreline sometime after dawn on April 27th, the way Cape Cod residents had walked that shoreline after every storm for generations, checking for what the sea had left behind. What the sea had left behind that particular morning was unlike anything the outer Cape had ever seen. Splintered ship's timbers scattered for what colonial correspondents would later describe as several miles of coast, canvas and cordage tangled in the dune grass, and, worst of all, bodies, dozens of them, then eventually more than 100. Rolling in with the surf over the following days as the ocean gave up what it had taken the night before. Word travels the way news always travelled on the outer Cape in 1717, not by printed paper, but by one household telling the next. A neighbour coming in from checking his own storm damage would have been the one to tell the nearest farm what he'd seen on the beach, and that farm would have told the next, and within a day or 2 the news had likely reached every settlement between Eastham and Wellfleet, a pirate ship, one of the richest anyone had ever heard of, wrecked and broken not 500 feet from shore, her cargo scattering across the sand for anyone willing to wade in and claim it. And claim it they did, in numbers that startled even the colonial official eventually sent to investigate. Massachusetts Governor Samuel Shute, on learning of the wreck, dispatched a cartographer and salvager named Cyprian Southhack to recover whatever could be saved for the Crown's share. Southhack didn't arrive at the site until May 3rd, nearly a week after the wreck, and what he found when he got there, recorded in his own written report, was roughly 200 local men, drawn from settlements as far as 20 miles away, already working the wreck site, pulling coin, cloth, tools and cargo out of the surf as fast as the tide delivered it. Southhack had also been instructed to see to the burial of the dead. He arrived to find that job already finished as well. A local coroner had buried the bodies that had washed ashore in the days before Southhack's arrival. And then, in a detail that captures something almost darkly comic about colonial bureaucracy, even in the middle of tragedy, presented Southhack with an itemised bill for the work. Southhack's own written account of what he found on arrival is worth paraphrasing a little more fully here, because it captures the scale of what was happening on that beach better than any summary can. He described finding roughly 200 men, drawn from settlements as far as 20 miles distant, already at work along the wreck line, and he noted with evident frustration that the ship, once she'd gone bottom up in the surf, had scattered her contents across a stretch of coastline he measured in miles rather than yards. This wasn't a handful of opportunistic neighbours. It was, in effect, an entire regional economy mobilising within days of the wreck, ordinary farmers and fishermen walking or riding considerable distances on the strength of rumour alone. Because the promise of Spanish silver washing up in the surf was worth far more than a normal week's labour to families living as close to subsistence as most Outer Cape households did in 1717. Southhack, arriving as the Crown's representative, had legal authority to claim a share for the government. He had no practical way to enforce it against 200 men who'd already been working the beach for the better part of a week and had no intention of handing anything back. This wasn't lawlessness so much as it was survival economics, working exactly the way it always had along that coast. Outer Cape Cod in 1717 was a hard place to make a living, thin soil, a short-growing season. A fishing economy dependent entirely on weather nobody could control. A ship's wreck, terrible as it was for the men who died in it, represented, to the people living along that shore, something closer to an unexpected harvest than a crime scene. There's no reliable evidence that anyone lured the wider onto that sandbar. That's a later, much more theatrical legend layered onto the story generations after the fact. What actually happened was simpler and in its way sadder. A storm wrecked a ship nobody local had any part in sinking, and the people who lived nearest to the wreckage did what people living hand-to-mouth on a hard coastline had always done when the sea delivered something valuable to their doorstep. They took it. Southhack, arriving too late to save much of anything for the Crown, produced instead something that would matter far more than any coin he might have recovered, a hand-drawn chart of the wreck's location, marking the spot where the wider had gone down with a small red X. He couldn't have known it at the time, but that map would outlive him by nearly 270 years, waiting in an archive for someone patient enough to use it. Southhack's mission to recover a Crown's share of the treasure, on paper his primary assignment, ended in almost total failure, and the numbers make the scale of that failure plain. Against a cargo estimated at something close to 4.5 tons of gold and silver. The best surviving accounts suggest he managed to recover only a small fraction of that value for the government he represented. A handful of chests and scattered coin, nowhere near enough to justify the expedition on its own financial terms. The overwhelming majority of the wider's fortune had already gone either into local pockets during the week before his arrival, or straight to the bottom with the ship herself, buried under sand that wouldn't give any of it back to anyone for another 267 years. It's a fitting, almost comic postscript to the whole affair, a colony that would go on to hang 6 men in the name of protecting lawful trade and Crown property recovered. In the end, barely enough of that property to cover the cost of sending someone to look for it. Meanwhile, The human aftermath was working its way toward Boston. 9 men in total survived the night of April 26th and 27th, Thomas Davis and John Julian from the Wider herself, plus 7 more from the Mary Ann, which had run aground close by but held together on her sandbar rather than breaking apart, giving her crew a fighting chance the Wider's men never had. All 9 were captured within days by colonial authorities and transported to Boston Gaol, where they waited through the summer under conditions grim enough that the Puritan minister Cotton Mather, a man whose name carries its own heavy weight from an earlier, darker episode in Massachusetts history, took a personal interest in ministering to them, recording their confessions, and preparing what he clearly hoped would be their souls, if not their bodies, for what was coming. Mather's involvement is worth its own moment, because the name carries weight beyond this single case. A quarter century earlier, Mather had played a significant role in the Salem witch trials, and by 1717 he was an ageing, still formidably influential Puritan minister with a well-established pattern of inserting himself into precisely this kind of high-profile moral drama. He visited the condemned men repeatedly in the weeks before their trial, recording what he described as their confessions and reflections, and by most accounts genuinely believed he was performing an act of mercy, offering souls he considered thoroughly lost the chance at a form of redemption before the gallows, even as he showed no inclination whatsoever to argue for clemency in this world. He later published his own account of the affair, framing the hanging of Bellamy's crew as a clear, providential end to the immediate threat of piracy along the New England coast, a conclusion that turned out to be premature, since the Golden Age of Piracy had roughly another 5 years left to run elsewhere, but a satisfying enough note for a Boston audience eager to feel that justice and God had both been served. What was coming arrived on October 18th, 1717, when 6 of the 9 went to trial in Boston: John Brown, Thomas Baker, Hendrik Quintor, Peter Cornelius Hoof, John Schwan, and Simon Van Vorst. All 6 were convicted and on November 15th, 1717, hanged in Boston before a crowd that period accounts describe as substantial, drawn by exactly the kind of grim public fascination piracy trials reliably generated throughout the era. 2 more of the 9, Thomas Davis, Al Carpenter, and a second forced carpenter from the Mary Ann named Thomas South, were tried separately and acquitted on the strength of testimony corroborated by multiple witnesses that both men had been compelled aboard against their will and had taken no active part in acts of piracy. It is, in its narrow way, a small vindication. The same system that hanged 6 men for a choice they'd made spared 2 who could prove they'd never really had one. It's worth naming one more of the 6 men hanged that November, because his story quietly complicates any simple picture of who these pirates were. Hendrik Quintor, one of the condemned, was of mixed Dutch and African heritage according to the surviving trial record, a detail that places him among the small number of Golden Age pirates of partial African descent, whose specific background survives in any documented form at all. Most such men appearing in the record only as an unnamed count, rather than an individual with a name and an origin. Quintor's presence on the gallows alongside 5 European-born crewmen is a small, blunt reminder that the system aboard Bellamy's ships treated a Dutch African sailor and an English one identically in life, sharing a vote and a share under the same articles, and that the colonial court in Boston treated them just as identically in death. The articles' equality didn't survive the wreck. The laws did, for exactly as long as it took to build 6 gallows. The Mary Ann's survivors, remember, were the 7 men who make up most of the 9 total, and their route to the gallows or to freedom ran through the same Boston courtroom as Davis and Julian's, even though their storm had been a different, survivable one. Among them was Thomas South, the forced Welsh carpenter mentioned a few chapters back, hoping even as he was pressed aboard to slip away and swim for shore the moment land came close enough. He never got that chance before the storm made the question moot, but his testimony, corroborated, like Davis's, by witnesses willing to confirm he'd been compelled rather than willing, was enough to save his life in October, when 6 of his shipmates from that same grounded sloop were not so fortunate. Two forced carpenters, taken off two different ships, tried in two separate proceedings months apart. Both walked out of the same Boston courtroom as free men on the strength of the same basic defense. I did not choose this, and here is who can prove it. It is, in its narrow procedural way, one of the more hopeful details of the entire aftermath, proof that the court, whatever its appetite for hanging pirates, was at least willing to look closely enough to tell the difference between a volunteer and a captive. And then there is John Julian, the ninth survivor, whose fate is the hardest to state with full confidence, and where the record itself grows noticeably thinner. Julian, roughly 16 years old, and Mosquito rather than English, colonial or African, was never formally tried alongside the other 8, a fact multiple surviving records agree on without fully explaining why. What most historians studying the case believe happened, based on the fragmentary record that does survive, is that he was instead sold into servitude or outright slavery rather than granted a trial at all, his status as an indigenous survivor apparently placing him outside the same legal process the English and Dutch pirates received, for better and very much for worse. One frequently repeated detail holds that he eventually ended up in the household of a family later connected, generations on, to President John Quincy Adams, a claim that shows up across multiple secondary sources, but that the primary documentation, by the honest admission of researchers who've gone looking for it, doesn't fully nail down. We'll flag it as likely well-sourced, but not airtight, because that's the honest place to leave it. What can be said without qualification is this: the boy who navigated the fleet safely enough to survive a storm that killed nearly 150 other men did not walk away free. He simply traded one kind of captivity for another without ever once standing in a courtroom to explain himself. There's a wrinkle in the timing of all this worth mentioning, because it complicates the tidy justice narrative Cotton Mather and the Boston court preferred to tell. In September of 1717, King George I issued a royal proclamation offering pardon to any pirate who surrendered before a set deadline the following year. The same general offer that would soon lure Benjamin Hornigold into a quieter retirement. Whether word of that proclamation had reached Boston, and whether it should have applied in some form to men already in custody awaiting trial, became a genuine point of later historical debate, with some researchers suggesting the colonial authorities may have moved with unusual haste specifically to see the men hanged before any pardon could complicate the proceedings. Nothing in the surviving record proves deliberate manipulation of the timeline, and it may simply be that colonial justice in 1717 moved at its own ordinary, unhurried pace regardless of what was happening across the Atlantic. But the coincidence sits there in the record all the same: a king offering mercy in September, a Massachusetts court delivering none in November, and no clean way, 3 centuries later, to know for certain whether that gap was accident or design. 9 survivors, out of something close to 180 men who'd sailed under Bellamy's articles that spring. 6 hanged. 2 acquitted. 1 sold away without so much as a hearing. Thomas Davis, forced aboard for his carpentry skills and forced ashore by a storm that killed everyone he'd spent months living beside, walked out of a Boston courtroom a free man and largely disappears from the historical record after that, which is, for a man who'd spent the better part of a year as someone else's prisoner, arguably the best ending available. Somewhere under the sand off Wellfleet, meanwhile, the Wider herself, and the gold, and the boy who'd wanted so badly to be part of all of it, simply stopped being anyone's problem. For 267 years, nobody came looking. News of the wreck and the subsequent trial spread through the colonial press with real speed for the era, and it's worth understanding why this particular case captured public attention as thoroughly as it did. Piracy trials were not rare in early 18th century Boston, but a case involving a captured fortune this size, a captain as notorious as Bellamy, and survivors willing to testify in detail about life aboard a working pirate ship gave colonial newspapers exactly the kind of sensational cautionary material readers couldn't get enough of. Cotton Mather's own published account of the affair sold well precisely because it combined moral instruction with genuine page-turning drama. a combination that would go on to define pirate storytelling for the next 3 centuries, right up through tonight's own retelling of it. In a real sense, the modern fascination with pirates, the Robin Hood mythology, the treasure, the doomed romance with a Cape Cod girl who almost certainly never existed as described, was already being manufactured within months of the wreck itself, by writers and preachers who understood, just as well as any modern storyteller does, that a good story about outlaws sells considerably better than a dry one about maritime lore. Physically, the wreck itself didn't stay visible for long. Within a matter of years, the same shifting Cape Cod sand that had doomed the ship in the first place began quietly burying her, storm by storm, until what had briefly been wreckage poking above the surf simply disappeared beneath the seabed entirely. The story didn't disappear with it. If anything, the absence of any physical proof only gave the local folklore more room to grow, unconstrained by anything as inconvenient as an actual visible wreck to check the details against. For 2.5 centuries, the Wider existed on Cape Cod almost entirely as a story, a name parents used to warn children away from dangerous currents. A rumour of buried gold that sent generations of amateur treasure hunters wandering the dunes with shovels. A ghost story about a witch who never got her pirate back. The ship herself, meanwhile, simply waited, a few hundred feet offshore, for someone patient enough and stubborn enough to go looking properly. You put your regulator in your mouth, check your gauges one more time out of habit rather than necessity, and drop backward off the boat into water so churned by centuries of Cape Cod current that visibility, on a good day, might get you 15 feet. This is the last chapter of tonight's story, and it belongs appropriately to the people who spent decades trying to make sure it got told at all. The man responsible for finding you down here, metaphorically speaking, was a Cape Cod native named Barry Clifford, born in Hyannis, Massachusetts, who grew up hearing the old local legend of a pirate ship buried somewhere off Wellfleet, and, unlike most people who hear a good local legend as children, never entirely let it go. Clifford began serious searching around 1982, working from a combination of local knowledge, oceanographic research, and, critically, Cyprian Sarthak's nearly 3-century-old hand-drawn chart. The same one Sarthak had produced after arriving too late to save the Crown's share of the treasure. That old map, with its faded red X, turned out to be more useful than anyone in 1717 could have imagined it would be. By your 3rd season of diving the site, working through sand that shifts constantly with Cape Cod's currents and burying artefacts under anywhere from 10 to 50 feet of seabed at a time, the picture Clifford's team was piecing together had grown from a hopeful theory into something close to certainty. In 1984, sonar and careful excavation confirmed a wreck site roughly matching the location Sarthak had marked. The following year, in 1985, divers recovered the single piece of evidence that turned probably the Wider into definitely the Wider. The ship's bronze bell, corroded but legible, cast with the words "The Wider Galley 1716. It remains, to this day, the only pirate shipwreck in the Americas ever positively, physically identified by name. Every other pirate wreck ever recovered is an educated guess. This one has a signature. What followed was decades of painstaking, often frustrating archaeology, the kind that rarely makes for exciting television, despite everyone's best efforts to film it that way. Over the years, Clifford's team and the researchers who joined them recovered well over 100,000 individual artefacts from the site. By some more generous counts, over 200,000. A scattered inventory that reads like an inventory of an entire vanished world: cannon, muskets, pistols, navigational instruments, cooking pots, personal jewellery, and coin after coin after coin. Spanish and Portuguese silver and gold, minted across 2 continents, each one pulled individually from sand that had to be painstakingly sifted rather than simply scooped. One researcher who worked the site for years described it as something like a 300-year-old superstore scattered across the ocean floor, an enormous variety of goods in enormous quantity, but never, despite everyone's hopes, the single concentrated motherlode of Bellamy's personal fortune that treasure hunters had always imagined finding intact. Some of the most meaningful work to come out of the excavation has been the slow, patient effort to reconstruct exactly who the 146 men aboard actually were, rather than treating them as an anonymous mass of pirates the way most surviving colonial records do. Cross-referencing recovered personal items, buttons, buckles, jewellery, tools of specific trades, against the fragmentary crew lists and depositions that survive, researchers have built a slowly sharpening picture of a genuinely international company. English and Welsh sailors like Davis, Dutch sailors like the men later hanged in Boston, at least one Mosquito pilot, and, by several historians' independent estimates, a meaningful number of men of African descent, some of them formerly enslaved, sailing not as prisoners, but as full members under the same articles as everyone else. It's the kind of detail that circles this whole story back to where it started tonight. On a slave ship's original deck, a vessel purpose-built to profit from human bondage ended her working life crewed, in significant part, by men that same system had once tried to own outright. The wreck can't tell us their names the way it eventually told us John King's, but it can tell us, artifact by patient artifact, that they were there. Barry Clifford didn't do this work alone, and it's worth naming the historian most responsible for turning scattered artifacts into an actual understanding of who these men were. Kenneth Kincaid, a historian attached to the expedition-wide Sea Lab in Provincetown for decades, spent years cross-referencing recovered objects against surviving court records, ship's logs, and colonial correspondence. The patient, unglamorous archival work that rarely makes it into a documentary, but is exactly what turned a warehouse full of coins and cannon into a coherent historical narrative. It was Kincaid who eventually persuaded Clifford to have a small shoe and its accompanying fibula properly examined by outside experts, rather than left in storage as an assumed curiosity. A conversation that took 2 decades to happen, and once it did, took less than a page of laboratory analysis to change the entire crew list. Most archaeological breakthroughs, contrary to how they're often dramatised, look less like a sudden discovery, and more like exactly this: an object sitting quietly in a box for 20 years until someone with the right question finally thinks to ask it. The sheer range of what's come up from the sand tells its own story about who these men actually were and where they'd actually been, in a way no written record could quite match. Alongside the expected pistols, cannon and coin, divers have recovered navigational instruments, cooking pots, cloth fragments, buttons, buckles, and personal jewellery pulled from ships that had flown 6 different national flags, a physical inventory of exactly how international and improvised a pirate crew's possessions actually were, since almost nothing aboard had been purchased. It had been taken ship by ship from Portuguese traders and Dutch merchantmen and English slavers alike, which means the wreck functions today as an accidental museum of early 18th century material culture from half the Atlantic world, compressed into a single debris field off one Massachusetts beach. A researcher who spent years on the excavation once compared the site to an enormous, chaotic general store from 3 centuries ago, and it's hard to find a more accurate description. Astonishing variety, genuine quantity, and, despite decades of careful searching, still no single concentrated vault of Bellamy's personal fortune waiting to be found intact. 2 years into the broader excavation in 1989, divers recovered something small enough that nobody thought much of it at the time. A child-sized leather shoe, a stocking of fine silk, and a short, delicate leg bone, all preserved together inside a mineral concretion, the natural process by which corroding iron objects fuse with surrounding sand and organic material into a single solid mass underwater. Whatever this was, it was catalogued, stored, and largely forgotten for nearly 2 decades, filed away among tens of thousands of other artefacts still waiting their turn for closer study. It took until 2006 for anyone to look at it again properly. Researchers at the Smithsonian Institution, working alongside archaeologist John DeBry at the Centre for Historical Archaeology, examined the 11-inch fibula more closely and reached a conclusion that changed how the entire crew list read. This wasn't the bone of a small-statured man, as everyone had casually assumed for 20 years. It was the bone of a child, somewhere between 8 and 11 years old. Cross-referenced against every surviving crew record for the Wider, there is exactly one person that description could possibly belong to. John King, last recorded threatening to harm himself and his own mother rather than be kept from a pirate's life, had just been positively as 3 centuries and a fused mineral concretion allow, identified nearly 300 years after the cannon that likely killed him. By 1988, 4 years after the initial discovery, the Massachusetts Supreme Court had ruled that the wreck and its recovered contents belonged, in full, to Barry Clifford, a legal outcome as significant in its own way as the archaeology itself, since it established, for essentially the first time in American maritime law, clear precedent for who owns what the ocean gives back. Clifford went on to open the Wider Pirate Museum in West Yarmouth, Massachusetts, and decades later a companion exhibit called Real Pirates opened in Salem, both built around the simple, still astonishing premise that everything on display is not a replica. Not a guess, not a Hollywood prop, it is the actual physical recovered contents of one specific ship, lost on one specific night, and identified by name. The 1988 Massachusetts Supreme Court ruling in Clifford's favour deserves a moment on its own legal merits, separate from the archaeology, because it settled a genuinely unresolved question in American maritime law: who owns a shipwreck's contents when the original owner has been dead for 270 years and no government ever formally claimed the site. Courts had traditionally leaned on old doctrines of finders' rights and abandoned property, but a case this size, this valuable, and this historically significant forced the issue into much sharper focus than any wreck before it. The ruling that followed established Clifford's claim clearly and became a frequently cited precedent for major American shipwreck cases that followed. From Spanish treasure galleons to more recent discoveries, a legal legacy the Wider left behind almost as significant, in its own quiet way, as the ship's status as the only positively identified pirate wreck in the hemisphere. And the site still hasn't finished surprising the people who study it. In more recent years, Clifford's team recovered a human thigh bone from the wreck, found in close proximity to a pistol researchers believe may have belonged to Bellamy himself, and the question of whose remains they'd actually found reopened a mystery nobody expected to still be asking 300 years later. Researchers connected to the project have since worked to trace living descendants of Bellamy's family in England, hoping a DNA comparison might finally answer, with modern certainty, whether the Prince of Pirates himself has been lying in that sand the entire time anyone's been looking. As of the most recent reporting, that question remains open, genuinely, scientifically open, in a way almost nothing else about this story still is. Somewhere off Wellfleet tonight, under sand that shifts a little more with every winter storm, there is still a chance that Samuel Bellamy himself is waiting to be identified by name, the same slow way John King eventually was. The ocean took its time giving up the boy. It may simply be taking longer with the captain. You don't have to dive at all to stand close to this story today. Walk through the Wider Pirate Museum in West Yarmouth, or its companion exhibit in Salem, and you'll find yourself looking through glass at objects that spent 3 centuries buried under a Cape Cod beach, cannon still faintly stained by the same sand that hid them, coins worn smooth by current rather than by circulation, and, in a case that draws visitors quieter than almost anything else in the building, a small shoe, a stocking, and a fibula that used to belong to a boy who wanted, more than almost anyone else in this story, exactly the adventure he got. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room full of strangers standing in front of that case. Nobody narrates it for you. Nobody needs to. The excavation itself has changed enormously since Clifford's first dives in the early 1980s, and it's worth understanding how much modern technology has reshaped work that once relied almost entirely on hand fanning through sand, with limited visibility. Later expeditions have used magnetometers to map buried iron objects across the debris field before a single shovel of sand moves, sonar surveys to track how the sandbar itself continues shifting year to year, and increasingly sophisticated conservation labs on shore capable of stabilizing waterlogged wood, corroded iron, and fragile organic material that would otherwise crumble to nothing within hours of reaching open air. What once took a diver with a hand fan an entire season to locate can now sometimes be mapped from the surface in a single afternoon. And yet, even with every advantage modern archaeology offers, researchers estimate the site has likely given up only a fraction of what it actually holds. The same shifting sand that first buried the ship for 267 years continues, stubbornly, to rebury sections of it nearly as fast as divers can clear them. It is, by any measure, one of the slowest ongoing archaeological projects in American history, and everyone involved with it seems to have made an uneasy peace with the fact that it may never technically be finished. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that this entire excavation only became possible because a fast, well-built ship happened to wreck close enough to shore in shallow enough water for anyone to ever find her again. Deeper water a few miles further out, and the wider's story likely ends the way most pirate shipwrecks end, as a name in a court record, with no artifacts, no bell, no bone in a silk stocking, nothing at all for a Cape Cod kid named Barry Clifford to grow up hearing about and eventually go looking for. Instead, the same shallow, treacherous sandbar geography that doomed 144 men that April night is the exact reason the other two men's story, and John King's, and Cyprian Southac's map, and every other thread woven through tonight's script, survived long enough to be told at all. The ocean that destroyed this ship is the same ocean that, 3 centuries later, quietly handed pieces of her back. Diving that site today, wherever today happens to fall relative to whichever expedition is currently working it, means descending into water that still occasionally gives up new fragments after 40-plus years of careful excavation, cannons still emerging from sand that shifts with every winter storm, coins still turning up in places divers have already searched a dozen times before. The wreck, in other words, still isn't finished telling its story. It's simply telling it slowly, on the ocean's schedule rather than anyone else's, the same patient, indifferent schedule that put the wider on that sandbar in the first place. So here's where tonight's story actually ends, not with the storm, and not even with the gold, but with a shoe, a small, expensive French-made shoe, built for a child who wanted an adventure so badly he was willing to threaten the person who loved him most to get it, sitting for nearly 3 centuries in the sand off a Cape Cod beach until 2 scientists with better instruments than anyone in 1717 had access to finally looked closely enough to say his name again. That's the whole shape of this story, really, a ship built to profit off human suffering, briefly, imperfectly, remade by the very people it was built to exploit into something closer to fair. A system of votes and shares and guaranteed compensation more generous than almost anything available to an honest sailor of the period, and then, in less than an hour. All of it undone by wind and water that didn't care one bit how democratically the ship below had been run. Somewhere in a Massachusetts museum tonight, behind climate-controlled glass, that shoe is still sitting exactly where the last 300 years put it. Thomas Davis walked out of a Boston courtroom and back into an ordinary, undocumented life, which might be the kindest ending anyone aboard that ship ever got. John Julian navigated a doomed fleet well enough to survive a storm that killed nearly everyone around him, and the reward the record gives him is another kind of captivity nobody bothered to write down in full. And Cyprian Southac's little red X, drawn in frustration by a man who'd arrived a week too late to save anything, sat quietly in an archive for 267 years, waiting for someone stubborn enough to still be looking. You're warm right now. You're dry. Nobody below you is creaking, and the only wind in the room, if there's any at all, is coming from a fan doing exactly what you asked it to do. 146 men went to sleep, or tried to, in a wooden hold not so different in size from your own bedroom, on a night when the ocean simply decided it wasn't going to let most of them wake up again. 2 of them did. A shoe survived when its owner couldn't. And somewhere off Wellfleet, the sand is still quietly deciding what else it's willing to give back. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.